Good evening and welcome. My name is Noah Rauch. I'm the Senior Vice President for Education and Public Programs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's very special program, Never Again or Not on Our Watch, Memorial Museums and the Challenge of Current Events. As always, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members and to those tuning in to our live web broadcast. Tonight's program is going to look at memorial museums, their roles and their relevance through the lens of two tragedies. The 1995 bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, which killed 168 people, including 19 children, and the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which killed 2,977 people here at the World Trade Center, at the Pentagon, and outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania. April 19th, 1995, and September 11th, 2001. Two dates that are forever etched into our country's consciousness. In the aftermath of these attacks, memorials and ultimately memorial museums were built at the sites where these attacks took place, with missions to commemorate, educate, and to help ensure that something similar never happened again, to provide a place, to quote Alice, for understanding ourselves and the world in which we live. Memorial museums had emerged in countries around the world in the latter half of the 20th century as a response to traumatic events, particularly those involving mass murder. These specific institutions attest to specific histories in Cambodia, Japan, China, Poland, South Africa, Chile, Argentina, and the United States, to name a few, while providing, as historian and friend of the museum, Ed Linenthal has stated, a powerful counterpoint to the anonymity of mass death in our time. And yet, current events from domestic terrorism to genocidal campaigns to the war in Ukraine to school shootings to COVID-19, and the list unfortunately goes on, have challenged these institutions with the question of whether to remain focused on the specifics of our particular stories or use our moral authority to address these contemporary tragedies. Tonight's program will explore this central question as we are joined by two very special guests who have been at the forefront of these institutions as their chief executives. The first doesn't really need an introduction, but I will provide one anyway. Our very own Alice Greenwald has been president and CEO of the 9/11 Memorial Museum since 2017. Prior to this role, she served as executive vice president for exhibitions, collections, and education, and director of the Memorial Museum, where she oversaw the articulation and implementation of a founding vision for this institution, managing its programming, collecting, exhibitions, and educational initiatives. Previously, she served as associate museum director for museum programs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she had a 19-year affiliation. From 1986 to 2001, Alice was a principal of Alice M. Greenwald Museum Services, providing expertise to various clients, including the Holocaust Museum, the Baltimore Museum of Industry, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the Historical Society of Princeton. She has also served as executive director of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, the acting director, curator, and assistant curator of the Hebrew Union College Skirball Museum in Los Angeles, and curatorial assistant at the Spertus Museum of Judaica in Chicago. She holds an MA in the history of religions from the University of Chicago's Divinity School and a BA with concentrations in English literature and anthropology from Sarah Lawrence College. Kari Watkins, a third-generation journalist and Cleveland, Oklahoma native, became the Oklahoma City National Memorial's first staff member as the communications director in 1996. 3 years later, she was named executive director, overseeing the design competition for the memorial and the building of the museum. Today, as president and CEO, she oversees the museum, which is one of Oklahoma's most visited sites, and serves as race director for the annual Oklahoma City Memorial Marathon. Kari has been recognized with several awards, including the Women in Communications Byliner Award, the Journal Record Woman of the Year, the Stanley Draper Award for Community Excellence, the University of Oklahoma Gaylord College of Journalism Distinguished Alumni Award, the Lee Allen Smith Oklahoma Legacy Award, and the 2017 John F. Kennedy Community Service Award. She earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Oklahoma and an MBA from Oklahoma City University. Both Alice and Kari sit on multiple boards and lead organizations that themselves have been recognized with numerous awards and national and international recognition. We'd like to thank you both for your work and for sharing your time and insights with us. And Alice, in particular, I'd like to thank you for your 16 years of leadership and service here, and for your steady advocacy of our educational programming, which include programs like this one. You've been an advocate for this work during my entire tenure here, and I can't thank you enough for that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers in conversation with this guy, Executive Vice President and Deputy Director for Museum Programs, Clifford Shannon.
I think I got to give Noah my biography or something. Anyway, welcome everybody. Welcome back, many of you. Kari, Alice, thank you. You know, in some ways this conversation can really span the lifetime of the two institutions that you lead. And I want to ask you about your own backgrounds first, and then you will bring us, I hope, in talking about your backgrounds, to how you got to these two places that you're now leading. Because some of the questions I want to ask you are questions that people ask me. You know, how do you get to do this kind of work? What brought you into this? And so, Kari, let me start with you and pose that question to you. What led you to the Oklahoma City Memorial?
It's a great question. I was actually doing a business transaction with a college friend who was a junior partner to that Bob Johnson had been named by the mayor and the governor to chair the Memorial Foundation. And a guy named Joey Ferretti, who today with Frito-Lay, PepsiCo Frito-Lay. But Joey just didn't think it was good that I would do this transaction and finish my MBA. He thought I should work. And he knew my personality, he thought, and thought I should keep doing things. And so he recommended me to Bob. And I had breakfast with Bob, I think, the next morning. And really, I haven't looked back. I think I understood Bob's passion for what he wanted this to become as a community model. And the Mayor Ron Norick at the time, who really had given this task force the process to not decide what it would look like, but what and if it would become. And he, really was a great example of getting the politicians out of the way and letting the people decide. And so I love the whole grassroots process of it. My dad was an elected official, and so I understood a little bit about community work, and it really was one of those things that was just a gift for me that would change my life forever, and I think was just meant to be.
Alice?
Well, first of all, it is a pleasure to be on this side, or not at the podium, so this is great. So the reality is that when I was a little girl, I did not grow up thinking that what I most wanted to do as an adult was run museums dealing with the worst events in human history. So it was not something I aspired to. In fact, I was on an academic track that was really heading towards a teaching career in religious studies, folklore and mythology and things like that. And I found out in graduate school that that was not something I enjoyed doing. So it was a good time to find it out. And I had a part-time job at a small Jewish museum. Noah mentioned it in the introduction, the Spertus Museum of Judaica in Chicago. And it was a revelation to me. I loved the world of museums. I just loved it. I loved that it was about packaging complex research into a three-dimensional form that would be available to the widest possible audience. I love that. I love that, I could go in one day and they'd ask me to spackle the wall, and the next day do the research and write a label. I just loved everything about it. And, eventually, as life happens to you, I got out to LA and became an assistant curator at another Jewish museum, and continued to love the work and just kept staying in the museum business as my career. And then when I was on maternity leave with my second child, I got a call. The Jewish museum world was very small, and I got a call from a colleague in that network in the late 1980s who had just begun working with the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. And they were looking for somebody to be on the exhibition design team and bringing the perspective of the American response to the Holocaust to the conversation. I had just been working as the executive director of a Jewish museum, another one, in Philadelphia, the National Museum of American Jewish History, and we had just done an exhibition on the American response to the Holocaust. So I became a consultant. That consultancy lasted for 14 years. Again, as life happens, I ended up moving to Washington. They hired me as the associate museum director, and I ended up spending 19 years with that project, from the earliest stages of conceptualization of the museum and the exhibitions, through to construction, through to opening. I helped in my consulting capacity set up their core museum departments. And I really was part of this incredible front row seat to the full trajectory in the life of the institution, from idea to reality to operation. And I was there in that capacity when in 2005, I received a phone call from the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation in New York. And the person on the other end of the line said, we've moved the memorial part of the project for what was then called the World Trade Center Memorial forward. The memorial design had been selected, and we're now ready to begin work on the museum part of the project. And would you be interested in coming and joining us for this? And I literally said on the call, I said, who in their right mind is going to take that job? You may recall it was fraught with politics. It was very volatile. There was another museum project on the site that the plug was pulled after an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal. It was just so volatile. And I just thought, I have the best job in the world. I love my job. Why would I leave? And, they sent me the information, and I said, I'd be happy to keep it. If I think of somebody, I'll let you know. The information arrives in the mail. I put it in my briefcase, and I don't look at it again. And I am literally on a plane flying back from a trip to Israel and Berlin. And I open my briefcase, and there's this information. And something about it struck me, and I thought, I've been with this project 19 years. You got to throw your hat in the ring and see if you still have it or whatever. And, maybe it'd be fun to have the conversation. And by that time, both of my kids were in New York, and they'd pay for me to come up, and I could take them to dinner. I mean, it was literally that kind of thinking. And I came up for the first interview, and I will tell you that Cliff was in the room. And I was so blown away by Cliff. I ended up hiring him a year later. But it was one of the best conversations I had ever had. With a smart group of people who were thinking with the same level of aspiration that I would have brought to the project. And I remember taking the train home and thinking, maybe I should. So that was that.
I want to, Kari, you talked about it, and Alice and I, you've spoken about this in the same way. You spoke about this as a gift to you. And that runs counter, I think, to, again, what people have often asked, and I'm sure it's the same for you, isn't this just very sad? And yes, there are sad elements to it, of course, but I think the gift element is really, really paramount in the sense of engaging with this material for others, in the memory of those who can't speak for themselves. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that juxtaposition, the sadness, which is an elemental part of the story, and yet the privilege, Alice used that word, of being the ones to tell this story.
Absolutely, it's the highest privilege. I mean, for someone to entrust their stories with you. I remember one of the first things we did after a long 5-year process of design and getting the right storyline, it was to ask family members for an artifact to represent their loved ones. And as family members would bring this to you, they'd hand them to you. They'd kind of come, it was hard to give up something that represented their loved ones. And I didn't have kids at the time. I don't think I fully appreciated how hard that must have been for people. Boy, just to have a front row seat to watch these people climb through the horror, and then to figure out how to put their lives back together, and to become friends and a trusted confidant with them, and to have when I say gift, to just have their gift of friendship and trust, and to be able to know that the work you do every day keeps the story alive, that 27 years later, frankly, in the world we live in, would be forgotten or moved on, or a little section in a history book, but it wouldn't be this grand, up-to-date museum that would tell their story of their loved ones and allow home movies and pictures and these very stories that humanize these victims, that put a face to them. And so I think when I talk about it's a gift, it's a gift that we were able to come together as a community to build it, and that the families and survivors and first responders were a part of it, and that today, now 27 years later, we've watched those people progress in their world. They've watched me progress in my own life. That's all my kids know. And so I think for them to understand that we're as concerned and our work is concentrated on keeping that story alive in whatever relevant terms we are in today is important. And so absolutely, you can't take the sadness out of the story. I mean, lives were lost, for no reason, and people's lives were changed. Innocent people didn't go to war that day; they went to work. And so I think when you look at it that way, the amount that they left and lost, it sometimes is unbearable. But then you look at the next generation, or you look at these kids who have become doctors and lawyers, and they figure out a way to honor their loved ones, or a survivor that's figured out how to put themselves back together and go back to work, or a rescue worker who has faced the worst demons in the world and can figure out how to train a new generation of rescue workers. That's a gift. That's a gift that we all do collectively.
Yeah. Alice?
Well, I think you said it beautifully, Kari. What I have learned is that when you are in the midst of telling the most difficult, most tragic, most traumatic stories, there is always the counterpoint. And a day doesn't go by where I don't hear a story about the best of human beings at a moment of the worst, the demonstration of the worst of who we are. And this was true at the Holocaust Museum as well. It is true here. There is an inspirational component to these terrible moments that remind you of our capacity as human beings for this spectrum of behavior, that it's in our control how we behave. The better angels, as Lincoln called them, you can call on those better angels. And there are so many stories, but, when you hear about Wells Crowther, the man in the red bandana, a kid, recently out of college, his first big job I think he was a bond trader, but he had worked as a junior firefighter in his community. And when the South Tower was hit, he went into action. And this young man, brought wounded people down tens of, flights of stairs. I mean, just incredible. Put the red bandana on. He saved people. I think he saved 17 people who didn't know his name, didn't know who he was, but they all knew the man in the red bandana. And it was interesting how they found out who he was, because somebody mentioned that in a newspaper, and his mother read the story and said that had to have been Wells. But you hear these selfless stories, and the one that has always stayed with me is from the Holocaust Museum, actually. And it was a story of a Polish woman who took in a neighbor's child, a Jewish child, and the child actually was placed in a cupboard. They didn't have an extra bed, but hidden in a cupboard in the house. And when the woman was asked after the war why she did that, why she would risk the safety and security of her own family, her own children, to take in a Jewish child, where if she had been found out, there would have been retaliation. She might have been killed, her children might have been killed. And she looked at the person asking her with this complete disbelief and quizzical and said, "Why would I do that? It's what you do. It's what you do." And I think it's that part of our human nature that these projects call forward. And they are reminders, they're harsh reminders, but they're reminders that that's there too. And it's up to us which part of our nature we privilege.
Yeah. You've both been with your projects from very, very early point. You were the first employee, and Alice, it was your arrival that really got the wheels turning. How have your institutions changed in the years? You were 25 years or so, Kari. Alice, 16 years. We didn't exist we existed as a planning institution. That's always the first. But, what's different about what the institutional responsibilities are, or how the institutions see their role in terms of their own growth, and each of you as the stewards of that institution?
Go first. I would say a couple of things. One is the storyline has not necessarily changed, but how we interpret the story has changed through media and technology. When we opened the museum in 2001, the iPhone was not in everybody's pocket. Smartphones were not, everyone didn't have one. And so I think that has been kind of revolutionized our world in so many ways. And so we looked at in 2010, then again in 2015, how to update the museum and meet our audience where they're willing to learn. We also talked about a lot when we were building the museum that someday we would teach a generation that was not alive in 1995. Well, that seemed to come really quick. And so we had to figure out how to teach the story in a way that people could consume it, that had not lived through it, had not watched it on the news every night. Matter of fact, a generation that didn't really even watch the news every night or read the newspaper every day. And so I think our institution has had to really change to make sure we're meeting our visitors where they're willing to consume the story. And not to be so arrogant to think that we're this great institution, everybody can learn it our way, but be willing to meet them where they're willing to learn it. So that's through a lot of technology, augmented reality, taking programs to schools as a prerequisite before they come, because today kids can get on their phones on the way down to the museum and they can learn a story in 5 minutes that may be completely different than what you're telling in the museum, or we're telling it off of facts and testimony and things have gone through trials. They could read some conspiracy theory or something else. And so I think we have to really figure out how to continue to teach it in a way that people are willing to learn. And like my own children learn with their fingers more than I ever did. And so how you're willing to put that story where they can touch it and feel it and understand it. And then I think also just making sure you're bringing along the family survivors and first responders with us. It's something we've worked really hard at. Have we done it perfectly? Absolutely not. But we've done it in a way that I think allowing them to lead tours early in the morning before the museum opens, or having them do a first person talk. Those are all ideas that we share with other museums, and so that we can continue to keep the story relevant and important and making sure that it meets them where they are. In the last chapter of our museum, we have 6 questions that we pose that are modern day concerns, and then we take you back and let you watch historic footage or lessons that we learned in the bombing. Memorialization, liberty versus security, forgiveness, these different topics that are touch points that you can literally watch young and old people grapple with. And I think that's something we have to continue to work on. I don't think our work is ever done.
Yeah, I know first-person voice in particular, and I just want to mention, we have many of our volunteers who are such an important part of our museum community here tonight in the program. I'm sure watching some on the video feed. But Alice, your sense of just the change over time.
Well, I think it is the generational shift. When we started planning the museum, it was 2006, the spring of 2006. We were 5 years from the event. This was an event that had been witnessed by 2 billion people on the same day around the world. It was almost impossible to imagine anyone walking into this museum that we were going to create who wouldn't come in with their own 9/11 story. And we joked at the time about, you don't need to really train docents because anybody could come in and be a docent because they would have their knowledge of the history, their entry narrative. And to be 20 years later and to realize that it's not just young kids who don't remember 9/11, it's kids graduating college and recruits in the law enforcement agencies, in the fire department, who don't know the story of 9/11. It's hard to believe that has happened so quickly, but it does shift what your priorities are. And the questions that people ask and want answers to also change over time. So that I would say in the early years, people would come to this site before there was a memorial, before there was a museum. There was a chain link fence around an enormous pit in Lower Manhattan. And people would hang on to the fence, just look in. There was a kind of a pilgrimage, trying to make sense of things. And the question they would ask to a person was, where were the Twin Towers? Where did they stand? That's not a question that kids ask anymore. Yeah. That the question now is, why would they do this? Why did this happen? So you have to move with the audience, and you have to build the programming that can begin to answer the questions that are being asked.
It's true. Once you can no longer assume that your audience knows the story, you really have to go backwards in the sense of you really are starting at square one again.
Starting all over, right.
And you have to recount the whole thing. You can no longer assume any knowledge of the event. But what about the institutional role? because yes, I understand the audience has changed, and both of you have, articulated ways in which you've responded to that. But are the expectations of each of your institutions changed, and by whom? By the public, by politicians, by interest groups? I mean, nothing stays static, so things must be changed. How would you characterize the change in expectation of the museum out in Oklahoma City?
I think people look to us as the community's conscience in some ways, and I think we have to figure out with each traumatic event how to respond. Is it by us sending hope bearers? Is it by us helping their community? And really each one has been different, but is it why we sit and wait and then they come to us to look at the memorialization process? Whatever that is, we've looked at different ways, and I wouldn't say there's ever two events the same, but I can remember sitting, on the in the community of Sandy Hook and some of those communities, and literally feeling some of the same feelings I felt in the early days of Oklahoma City. I mean, different story, different event, but humans grieve very similar. I mean, it's horrific loss. It's needless, and so I think to recognize the senselessness of the violence is mandated in our mission statement. It's something we really believe in, is to point out that this didn't have to happen. There are other ways to do it. And I think the one thing we have to figure out, I believe, is, how to do that in a way that's not just social media, not just a poster, but real hard work. How do we, as communities, as humans, put in the work to go make change? Because the headlines don't work, the prayers and thoughts, that's all sounds great at the time, but what's the real work that has to be done to make the change? And is that a role our institution takes on? Maybe so. I mean, I think that's something we have to look at. But we have to look at each one of those and decide, are we ready to cross that line, or is that something that is part of our mission? Is that something we all do together? I mean, that's something I think we just have to look at case by case.
Alice, we're facing similar kinds of questions here.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the way I want to answer your question, Cliff, is how people perceive us, because that influences what they expect from us. And, we've made such a conscientious effort to stay nonpartisan as an institution. This isn't about politics here. This is about people. And, the way we tell our story of what happened on 9/11 is, again, very self-consciously the human experience of a historical event. So when people come in, what they understand is what it felt like, whether you were in the buildings, whether you were on the planes, whether you were watching in horror on TV, wherever you were, it is the emotional reality that you went through in experiencing this historic event. And I think that has actually moved the way people see us. We are a place to learn empathy. We are a place where people see themselves in the story, as is your museum. It is a place that is a champion and an advocate for resilience in the face of adversity. And I know, because it happens a lot, when terrible things happen, people come to us for assistance. How do we memorialize this event? How do we honor our loved ones in our community? How do we go through this process? Cliff and I were just in Norway on a project we've done for the past 12 years, almost, to commemorate the terrible events in 2011 in that country. But this year, just a few months ago, I had a call from the UN ambassador from Ukraine, Mr. Kitslitsia. He reached out to me. And he reached out to me because he wanted to know, he had read about our survivor trees. We both have survivor trees, but there's a lot in common here. And we have our survivor tree, which really is this magnificent emblem of resilience, and do I have to share the story, or do you all know it? This is the tree that was burned and broken and found at the recovery site by 2 recovery workers in the early part of the fall of 2001. And they saw some life in this tree, and they brought it to a nursery in the Bronx, and it was nursed back to health. And when it left the site, it was 8 feet tall. And when it came back in 2010 to acclimate ahead of the opening of the memorial, the tree was now 30 feet tall. And you, to this day, can see the new growth, the gnarled, scorched bark, which moves into smooth bark for the new growth that has come back. And every year, around the 1st of spring, this tree, standing in the middle of 400 swamp white oaks that leaf out very late in spring, this tree is awash in flowers, and it is spectacular. So it is this embodiment of renewal and resilience and rebirth after unthinkable harm. And every year we give out 3 seedlings of the tree to communities that have suffered some tragedy, whether it is as a result of humanly perpetrated extreme violence, terrorism, or a natural disaster. And we usually don't announce who gets them until around the anniversary of 9/11 every year. And he was calling me to see if we could provide a seedling for Ukraine. And he felt very strongly that the symbolism was essential for his community at this moment in time. They were fighting the odds. They are fighting the odds. They are living every day in the worst imaginable circumstances. But if they cannot remember that there is hope and resilience, even in the worst situations, a situation like 9/11. And you may recall that, President Zelensky, actually, when he spoke to the US Congress, referenced 9/11. He said, this is our 9/11. So the ambassador was seeing something in who we are and what we represent that resonated for him and he felt was essential to his fellow countrymen. And I don't think I'm giving anything away early, but I think it's pretty much a shoo-in that they might get a seat. But
That's a scoop for everybody.
But don't, it's not public yet.
I want to come more specifically to the theme we evoked in the title of the program, which is, the challenge of current events as they change, as they evolve, for institutions that are about a moment in history, but as you both have said, they have moral messages, they have emotional messages that people are drawn to connect to what's going on in the world. But history or current events pose a challenge, but they also pose a danger to these institutions. As partisan and as divided as the society is now, it's very easy to get pulled to one side or another. And I think you both have said that the common ground aspect of what both of our institutions do is critical to its success. So let's talk about what it is to be an institution that is in your community, the conscience of the community. And yet, I imagine people are turning to you for all kinds of affirmations of their own view of what conscience requires. And so that's got to be very, very tricky. And yet, there are moral issues that you want to speak out on.
I think for us, just like you guys, we work very hard not to be a political organization. Now, we welcome politicians and elected officials of all backgrounds, all faiths. Just like 9/11, April 19th, the terrorists didn't discriminate. There were people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all socioeconomic levels, all races. And so I think when we look at our job now, 27 years later, it is to represent as many as we can and to use our mission of teaching the senselessness of violence. That's part of our mandate. And so we have to make sure we speak out on things even when it's hard. And so, the word, do you use the word insurrection or do you use the word attack? Those kinds of things we wrestle with way more than people ever understand. We sought great advice on those types of things. The night of January 6th, before we went home, my team put out education materials and they were in teachers' mailboxes that night or when they got to school the next morning of how do you respond to these things? And so I think that looking back at those kinds of events, I'm proud of a staff that will work night and day to put this information out so that we can help teachers understand it and then teach it in a way that's non-political, but is the facts. And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, getting the facts and understanding them and processing it without the noise of the media or the noise of the right or the left, just basic facts, just what happened here. And as you work through that, I think our institution just wants to make sure that whatever happens, we're teaching how senseless the violence is and putting a face to those victims of terrorism or whatever the event is. Because it isn't, we say this all the time, it isn't about the politics, it's about the people. What happened in Oklahoma City, what happened in New York City, what's happened everywhere since, it is about the innocent people who are just trying to do what they do. They are not fighting war. And so how do you protect them and how do you continue to tell their story? That's really important to us. And then I think also is just making sure that your elected officials around you, I mean, while they're part of our community, they're part of our events, they know when we speak up, we're speaking on behalf of the institution, and it's not, red or blue, right or left. It's just the facts, and that we hope they'll honor that and not make political hay out of it. And we've been very fortunate of that and have a great relationship with our elected officials. And sometimes we'll agree on things, and sometimes we won't. Sometimes they can't take a stand on stuff because of where their party is. And I think that's an issue we have to look at, I think, as a nation, as a society, of how do we come back to the middle. We've had a tagline at the memorial for the last 2 years, on this sacred ground, we'll work to find common ground. If there's ever a place that people should work together, it's on the grounds in which we keep. On these grounds is, there is no more sacred space. People lay down their lives on behalf of their country or on behalf of someone's own mission. And how do we honor those lives with how we move forward?
Alice, has the tightrope gotten smaller or higher or more tricky over the years?
I would actually say it's falling into a landmine off the tightrope.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to avoid being part of what are really the culture wars at this point. And it's a constant process of trying to figure out how to navigate in a way that is not taking sides, but is focused on mission. So I'll give you two examples, and one is actually from our institution, one is from the Holocaust Museum, and maybe I'll start there. You may remember in 2019, there was a very public statement made that the ICE detention centers at the Mexican-US borders were like concentration camps. And this created a furor among Holocaust survivors, some Holocaust. You can never say generally all feel some way, because within every stakeholder group, there is a spectrum of opinion and belief and political persuasion. But there was a loud outcry about this. How dare you, appropriate my history, the history of, the Nazi concentration camps and everything that goes with it, and say that about something that our country is doing. Of course, forgetting that there were concentration camps here for the Japanese Americans during World War II, but that's another story. So the Holocaust Museum leadership, in response to their constituents, put out a public statement saying, you cannot and we do not defend any analogies with the Holocaust, which in turn created a furor in the academic world. And they received a petition from, it had to be hundreds of scholars and historians saying, what is the point of learning history if you can't make analogies? It's not the same thing, but it certainly can teach us something. And if you just say this is over here and you can't learn anything from it, it is, sui generis and it's unique and it means nothing other than what happened in that moment in history, he said, then history is not worth teaching. And it was an incredibly big blowout. Now, we had a much smaller situation here in 2020 where, not thinking of this as a culture war situation, but thinking within the context of our own institutional health and safety program. This is the middle of a pandemic in 2020. I think we're still in the middle of a pandemic. And we were planning our annual commemoration that September. We were going to reopen the museum to the public on September 12th, reopen it to the families on September 11th. And we had a problem, which is that our commemoration, which self-consciously does not involve any speechifying by politicians. We invite everybody, elected officials, but we don't let them speak. In the early years, they would read verse and quotations that we would be pre-selecting for them. But the centerpiece of our commemoration is the reading of the names. And the reading of the names, 2,983, because we honor 9/11 and the 1993 victims. Reading those names takes about 4 hours. And it's a pandemic. The way we always do it is you're on a stage, there are 2 microphones, and people come up one after another to read the names. It takes about 140 people to do this reading. And we made the decision, we agonized over this, but we said, this may not be the year to do a live reading of the names. It would mean people taking their masks off, and at that point, we had mask requirements on our plaza. You remember those days? And it would mean wiping down with alcohol and disinfectant the microphone after each reader stood there speaking into the microphone. And we just thought, this is a dangerous way to go this year. We could be putting people in jeopardy. Many of our constituents are suffering with 9/11 related illness. It just felt like the smart and most prudent health and safety thing to do would be to use recorded names readings from prior commemorations. So it would still be family members reading and speaking the names, put big loudspeakers all over the 8-acre plaza so that no matter where you were, you'd hear it. And it would still take 4 hours, but it would not be this centralized location where you'd have crowds gathering around a stage and people taking their masks off and reading the names. So we make this decision. We send a letter to the families of 9/11 victims. And I think it was in the mail for 2 seconds before we started to get the blowback. And it was really intense. I mean, the New York Post called us out, called me out about it. How dare they not do a live reading of the names? This is the slippery slope, the beginning of the end. How can we, forget our obligation to the families? And it was really being caught in the middle of the people who didn't want to see the health and safety considerations as the driving reason or even as a threat, and other people who felt this would be putting our constituents and our attendees in jeopardy. It was not resolved to anyone's satisfaction. We ended up proceeding as planned, but there was a group of family members who actually held an alternative commemoration a block away. And to show you how political it was, Rudy Giuliani, who almost always comes to our commemoration because he was, America's mayor in 2001, and this is part of his personal legacy, he didn't come to us. He went to the other one. So it was definitely a culture war vise that we found ourselves in, trying to do the right thing for the right reasons as we saw them, but we got caught in the middle of, in the same way the Holocaust Museum, I think, got caught in the middle of the ICE detention center controversy.
Kari, you have something that's, I think, come to raise issues for you that's even more contemporary in the sense of sort of the ideological continuity between Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, and his extreme anti-government stance, and some of the voices that have arisen in far-right movements up to and including January 6th events. And you were also in the spotlight for pointing out these comparisons and raising issues where some of your local politicians, who in other cases I think would have been very supportive of what you'd done, were not necessarily that supportive. So talk a little bit about being caught in that kind of a problem.
Well, I think, one of our lines of mission statement talks about teaching the senselessness of violence, especially as a means of affecting government change. That's a direct line of our mission statement. And so that's a line we used that night in our teaching tools to the educators. And I think some politicians thought we were trying to make, get in political warfare of that. We weren't. We certainly weren't. I remember sitting in my office watching one of the people who crossed the line carrying an Oklahoma flag and thinking, how in the world could anyone from Oklahoma go against their government after what we've lived through? Question I still wonder, frankly. And so I think we worked really hard not to be political in that, but it was the discussion we still talk about. It's a lesson we have to continue to teach. A generation of people who, as I said earlier, thinks they can sound off on Twitter or Instagram and that's all they need to do, and that they've spoken their piece, but they really haven't done the work. And so I think we have to continue as an institution to look at those opportunities to teach and to educate, but not to become political. So our job is to make sure, we either discuss it with the elected officials' office and tell them, here's what we're doing and here's why. There are just moments in history, and there always have been, since the days of the Bible, where people don't agree. People see truth from two different perspectives. And what I see as truth and what you see as truth may be different. And so, we have to continue just to go down the middle and try to build bridges and not walls, and try to bring people to the center. I think of Father Reed, who we awarded one of our awards to, who worked on the Irish Army and talked about meeting people in the street, literally walking out to the center of the street and trying to bring the other side to the street to talk to. I think that's really one of our challenges as a country and as an institution, is trying to go to the middle and bring people along. We've started a program called Better Conversations. Ironically, we started ahead of COVID in a plan to put phones down and computer. It's kind of ironic, but to put things down and to have face-to-face conversations. Something I don't think this young generation has been taught well or knows how to do. But and then COVID hit, so what did we do? We went to Zoom and had these conversations. It's crazy, but people needed them, and people still need them. And so we try to have these conversations on relevant topics that bring people to the table and allow each other to hear others' perspective and to respect it and to honor it. Even though if we walk out of here tonight and we don't agree, I've at least had the chance to hear your perspective, and I can think about that and mull that over. So I think as an institution, we have to keep looking for ways to bring people to the table and discuss. Even if it's elected officials who don't agree with us, even if it's families and survivors who don't agree with us, even if it's a community person who may not ever even come to the museum, except they would come through this program because they want to understand why you have a belief that you do, or why we just want to go talk on this topic. And so I think we as an institution have to keep bringing people together, like we are tonight, like we are many other times, of having open dialogue and being willing to hear your perspective, everybody else's perspective, and then seeing how we can grow and learn from that.
Alice, let me ask you, how damaging are these kinds of disputes or tensions or accusations against institutions like ours? What is the risk assessment? You can't, there are times where no matter what you do, you're going to get caught. But, is the damage that damaging? Or is there a way to know how damaging these kinds of things are going to be?
I think, Cliff, that you have to keep your eye on the ball. And you're always going to be, because you're in the public eye, and you're at a sacred site that has a great deal of resonance for people, and people have their own, they bring their own life experience to these places, that you're going to be the target of attacks. And sometimes it's from one side of the spectrum, and sometimes it's from the other, and you never know when it's coming, and you can spend hours on the phone trying to deal with it when it happens. But the reality is that's not what we're here to do. And what we are here to do is to tell a story, and to tell a very difficult story that is meant, actually, ironically, to give people hope, to be therapeutic for people, and to be a container for something that was so profoundly wounding of all of us as individuals and as a nation and as a world community. It's a place to put that pain so you can continue on with the rest of your life. And that is a sacred mission. You keep your eye on the ball. So there's that controversy. They had their own commemoration. We're still here. Yeah. We're doing the work. And students are coming in, and families are coming in, and thank God people internationally are coming back. And it's doing its job, which is to bring people to the point where they see themselves in this story and they think, that could have been me. That could have been my loved one. This is not acceptable. This is not the way you negotiate grievance and difference in an interconnected global community. If we have people coming here and leaving with that thought, it doesn't matter how many controversies we face, because they have gotten the message.
I mean, the audience or of critics is, I think, relatively small, certainly compared to the vast numbers of people who have come to these institutions, both of which have been very well received by their audiences. So, it's a very good reminder that, the craziness that's, in the Twitterverse is not necessarily the defining characteristic of what it is we do. Let me see if we have any questions from our audience members. William Raff, it's a pleasure to see you back here. Hang on 1 minute. William, hang on. We're going to give you a mic, so you get to declaim to all of us.
Thank you. For each of you, having been at these humanitarian institutions for many years, what are some of the most personal satisfactions that you've experienced?
I have this one story that I tell a lot because for me, it personally meant the world. There was a mother who lost her daughter, her early 20s. And we were in one of the final meetings of working out the mission statements. It was early March of 1996. And I knew of her because her daughter had gone to school with my husband, but I didn't really know her. But a young man who lost his mom, had wanted to add the word hope in our mission statement. May this memorial offer comfort, strength, peace, hope, and serenity. Well, in 1996, hope really was a 4-letter word. People didn't have hope in Oklahoma City. Town was devastated. We were trying to put ourselves back together, trying to figure out how to move forward. And so for a family member who had lost someone, to recommend it was incredibly courageous. But to a mother who had lost a daughter, didn't see it quite that way. So there were a few exchanges of words for a couple hours, I think it went on. And in the night, she agreed to disagree and let the word hope be added. So today, our mission statement has always read, may this memorial offer comfort, strength, peace, hope, and serenity. And over time, we became friends. And as the museum was going forward, we had a kind of a working group of family members and survivors who would come. I called them Wednesday night prayer meetings because in Oklahoma, everyone goes to church on Wednesday night. And Wednesday night happened to be the night that we could all meet. And the police chief and the fire chief and all these people could come together and meet. And so we met what we thought was going to be like a month and ended up being like, I think, 18 months. But they all still speak to us, so which is a good thing. But Janine was a part of that committee, and she'd come every Wednesday night downtown Oklahoma City to from her house. Not an easy journey, but she came every week. And every week she would read copy labels and look at artifacts and pictures. And the fire chief, all these people would do this. And she had great input. And as we were dedicating the memorial and President Clinton was coming, the advance team asked me to choose a couple of folks to give the tour with us to the president. And so I chose her because Oklahoma's pretty Republican, and she was one of the few Democrats I knew, and so I thought she was like a natural. Plus she'd really gotten into the story, and she had taught me so much about kind of her personal loss. But as we were waiting for the motorcade to arrive, which I'll never forget this day as long as I live, we were standing under the large 5-story bronze gates, and she grabbed my hand, and she said, "I can't imagine this place without hope." And so I thought in those 2.5 years, how she had gone from a very angry, upset mother, which I totally get now that I'm a mom, that I'm not sure I'd be out of bed yet. So I give her so much credit. And she had these 5 strong girls, and to lose one of them. And she passed away this past year. And as I stood there at her service, listening to the comments, I'm thinking about the strength and the character and the courage of this woman. And she represented so many more that were just like her. But for me to have walked that journey with her, what an honor to get to learn from her and to watch her motherhood and how strong she was just, a journey for me of a lifetime. But to understand that she got from complete anger and kind of just pure loss to a position of understanding hope changed my life forever.
I don't even know how to follow that. They're just spectacular, really beautiful.
That's her story, not mine. It's her story.
So, William, there are 2 stories that I'm thinking about, and I don't know which one to tell, actually. But I said earlier that a day doesn't go by where we don't learn something that moves us. And this was actually very early on in my tenure here, and I met a woman who was a professor of social work at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, by the name of Marilyn Rosenthal, who lost her son Josh in the South Tower. Marilyn was a very unusual woman. She wanted to meet the man who was exactly the age of her son, who was the pilot of Flight 175 that was crashed into the South Tower. She wanted to meet the family and the mother in particular, so that she could mother to mother. Both mothers lost sons. Both mothers were grieving. Where she could find that common ground. And this wasn't an idle idea of hers. She actually wanted to make it happen, and she contacted the US State Department. She contacted the ambassador, this young man, Marwan al-Sheikhi, was an Emirati, and she spoke to the ambassador, and he got her in touch with somebody, and she flew to Abu Dhabi and was met at the airport by a young man with the same last name, not a close relative, a distant relative of the hijacker. It's all tribal, and everybody's related to somebody along the way. And he was very personable. And the first thing he said to her was, "There's no way Marwan would have done this. He, everything I've heard about him, he was a nice kid, he was a nice guy, he was a, funny, upstanding, warm. No way. He must have been kidnapped or killed and his passport taken." And, he had a whole story for what had happened. Meanwhile, she already knew that he was in a training camp in Afghanistan and lived in Hamburg with Muhammad Atta. I mean, he was a known quantity. But she wanted so desperately to meet his mother and to make some kind of connection, human connection. And she talked to me about, she didn't know what she would say to this woman. Maybe she would just hug her. They wouldn't speak the same language. She really worked this through. But the man who met her at the airport, the distant cousin, had, through the family relations, access to Marwan's older brother. The mother would not meet with her. And they thought, well, at least she might be able to meet the older brother. And the older brother said no. The family was hounded by journalists. Mother was, a mess. There was no way they were going to have this meeting. And she accepted that that was what it was. She learned as much as she could about the family and about him. And this gentleman brings her back to the airport on her way home. And the last thing he says to her is, "Why would Marwan do that?" Not, "He didn't do it. Help me understand why he did do it." And that to her was extremely telling. But what moved me was, and she's since passed away, what moved me was the impulse as a mother to reach out to another mother. It's almost impossible for me to imagine wanting to talk to the mother of my child's murderer. I would find that more than I could possibly do. But for Marilyn, it was part of her healing, that she needed to know how this could have happened. And that was what her outreach was. It is a remarkable story. And it has stayed with me all these years. 16 years later, I remember sitting with Marilyn and hearing her story and just thinking, this is the most extraordinary thing I've ever heard. So you learn constantly on this job about ways to be human. And sometimes they're good ways and sometimes they're bad ways. But you learn what it means to be human. And that is just the most extraordinary thing for me. I mean, in terms of what stayed with me, Marilyn Rosenthal has stayed with me, yeah.
We have one more? Lauren.
Thank you, Cliff. Alice, I'm just curious, and certainly for Kari, over years and years of planning a museum before opening, what are some examples or something particular that you thought the public would interact a particular way, and then when we opened the doors, you were completely taken aback maybe by how they interacted, or maybe they didn't, it's not even a part of their experience that we may have thought differently about in our planning efforts.
Wow.
What did we get wrong?
Yeah, what did we get wrong? Well, first of all, I just want to say that Lauren manages brilliantly our Survivor Tree Seedling program, so I hope she's not angry with me for sharing this. We took a lot of chances with the museum. You know, we were, I would say that the Spencer Finch piece was the one thing that was the most, I was taking the most chance on. This is the enormous blue wall. It's the art installation that sits between the two tower volumes. And there are not too many works of art in this museum. We have tribute expressions. We have art pieces that are part of the history, like the Basinski music that plays at the end of the first part of the historical exhibition. But this is not an art museum. And we made a decision to have an invitational art installation on that wall, which literally separates the public space of the museum from the medical examiner's repository of remains of the unidentified and unclaimed victims of the World Trade Center, 9/11 at the World Trade Center. And we felt that art would be, or intuitively we felt that art would be the only way we could help our visitors mediate the understanding of where they were literally standing. This wall that was a membrane dividing you from life and death, if you will. And even at my board level, my program committee, we brought them in. There were a number of people on that committee who were family members, art collectors, who said, we love this idea of this installation, but you're making a terrible mistake in doing it, because if it fails to move people, that's the only thing people are going to talk about when this museum opens. And you've spent 8 years, putting this place together, and the only thing they're going to talk about is that terrible work of art, when you get down to the basement. And it took an act of faith, I have to say, on the part of many of us on staff, on our chairman, the members of the board who advocated for that. And ironically enough, not only did the piece resonate with literally everyone who walks into this museum, but it is the image of choice for all of our VIPs who come, who want to be seen in front of the Finch installation. So, we have the Pope, we have the presidents, it's quite extraordinary. This is this is the iconic place. So that was a gamble that worked out, I would have to say. But we didn't know. We just, you don't know, honestly. You work, you plan, you make the best decisions you can make, and you do not know till the doors open how it's going to be experienced. You just don't know.
Kari?
I think for us, it was part of the outdoor symbolic memorial with the design of the empty chairs and the names that are etched. That was a huge leap of faith, and at the time of just putting names on there. And then there were some moms that were pregnant, and adding those names, even though they weren't counted to the 168, something we wanted to add. The families felt strongly about that, so we did. And then in the museum would be the Gallery of Honor, where we literally asked a family member to bring an object a certain size that would represent their loved one, and think about your life and how you would be represented in a 3x4, acrylic box, and how that would look. And so I think we thought it would be powerful. I don't think we totally, even though our conscience committee and our family survivor committee would process it, I don't think we really realized how hard that would be for families to give us things. We're down to all the boxes are full, I think, except for one. And people are like, why don't you just fill them? I'm like, because that's a family project. A lot of people are like, I'll just give you the money, just go buy something. I'm like, no, that's not what it's about. It's about the families telling their story. And so then they can go to an interactive and learn why that object's in there. They may watch some home movies. They may watch their family around their loved one's chair today with grandkids or great-grandkids. And so that's part of the living, breathing memorial that keeps going. And I think that's something that we knew would be powerful. I don't think we understood how much it would humanize the person, and people can relate to those objects of faith or Mickey Mouse or, some sports team, whatever it is. People can all of a sudden go, wow, that person was like me, or that person had a similar name, or that had the same Bible, whatever, same crucifix. I mean, there are those objects that become very personal to the people who were killed and to their families. Then the visitors now, 27 years later, can still relate to those.
Thank you, both of you. I think it's remarkable to sort of, come to this point in now the mature life of both institutions and think about the trajectories, think about the challenges, but most important of all, think about the impact on so many people who have visited over the years. And in spite of whatever the noise is in the background, I think both of you have done a remarkable job of giving something that is a gift to people. It may not always be the easiest gift to understand or to receive or to take, but nonetheless, I think it's at the core of both places. So please join me in thanking Kari Watkins and Alice Greenwald.